Welcome to another Hamman 2-Up review, where 2 bots enter and 1 bot leaves. Today for your viewing pleasure we have Studio Series Bumblebee Starscream vs Soundwave. Begin! Welcome back, Robo fans. That's right, it's time for another 2-Up review where we get 2 bots in the arena, stack them up in a bunch of categories and see who comes out on top. I think it's fair to say that both of these bots were highly anticipated by the fandom. Today's categories will be Sculpt, Screen Accuracy, Paint Apps, Posability, Accessories, Alt Mode, and Overall Vibe. Let's get into it, shall we? Now, at first glance, there's no denying that Soundwave has a much cleaner silhouette. Starscream has what can only just be described as a nightmarish amount of kibble with all this backpack struts and things. And I do have to say that the lines on Soundwave, the surface details, all come together to make him feel like a much more cohesive figure. I think you'd almost be forgiven for assuming that he doesn't actually transform, which arguably he kind of doesn't, but more on that later. Starscream, on the other hand, whilst he does everything that you would want a Starscream to do, there's just something about his proportions that just seems off. Like those arms, if we stretch them out, they almost come all the way down to his knees, which just gives him a weird, gangly, almost Scooby-Doo Shaggy-esque kind of demeanor. Soundwave, on the other hand, he almost feels like his arms are too short by comparison to the rest of his body. His sculpt to me just feels so much more toyetic, and I think this design is a great example of everything that the Bumblebee movie did correctly. Like, there is no denying that this is our boy Soundwave. Starscream, by comparison, almost has a little bit too much going on. For a figure that seems like it was, if not sharing parts, at least the engineering philosophy was based off of Blitzwing from the Bumblebee movie, he just doesn't quite seem to deliver the same aesthetics that figure managed to do. I also feel like when, traditionally in G1 at least, these wings have such a clean design and silhouette to them, that the kind of kibbly, bendy, foldy mess that we've got going on here just doesn't really do him justice. It does look a lot better from the back, but then once you flip him around, hello, you can actually see all the way through, which breaks the illusion just a little bit. It's hard to take him all in at a glance at once. And whilst there are certain angles where he does bring that kind of Starscream vibe that you're looking for, when you pull him back further, he just doesn't quite do it for me. He's got a little bit of that Transformers Prime, like, elongated quality to him, but not enough to make it seem deliberate, in my opinion. For whatever reason, Starscream's sculpt should look cool, but it just doesn't. And for that reason, the sculpt point goes to Soundwave. I guess in this respect, my friend, you truly are superior. Now let's have a look at screen accuracy. So, for this, we're gonna have to go to the playback.
Decepticons, attack! Destroy the launch pad! Let none escape! Ravage, eject!
Now, admittedly, you don't get to spend a lot of time on screen with either of them. But for my money, I feel like Soundwave honestly just looks a lot more like he's jumped off the screen and into my life. Starscream does do a good job as well, like they are both pretty good renditions of those on-screen models that we saw. But I just can't quite put my finger on what it is. There's just something a little bit gangly and unseemly about Starscream. Maybe it's how his head attaches to his body, maybe it's the length of his limbs. I think in terms of accuracy as well, what gives Soundwave the edge here is that there was no on-screen alt mode that his figure had to try and replicate. So whilst I am forgiving of some of those inconsistencies with Starscream, and I do think that he also does a really good job with screen accuracy, it's our boy Soundwave who gets that point. When it comes to the apps, let's break them down individually to see just what they've done to try and bring these sculpts to life. Now, credit where credit is due. Both of these figures have done a great job of picking out some fine details and having the apps boost their sculpts in almost every way. I mean, look, on Starscream, you've got the individual painted lines on that faux sort of cockpity bit, which does a lot of heavy lifting in that central area, in my opinion. Same as how they went to the effort to pick out both sets of vents and have that carry through on his shoulder. Like these ones, you'd be disappointed if they didn't do, but you would forgive them if they didn't pick out this bottom set of vents. But they did, so kudos. I think what also helps this sculpt feel a little more alive than it potentially could have is, as well as having the sort of flat grey that you sort of expect from a Starscream, we do also have a lot of these metallic silver apps through. And I think they've done a good job of choosing exactly where to place those. It would have been nice, I think, if the top of this cockpit here, if that had been able to be the same see-through plastic, I think it probably wouldn't have stood out as much as it does. But I find that it draws your eye away from his face onto that sort of, lemony yellow. Where I think some of this broken up paint scheme doesn't work as well is when you come down to the legs. So the metallic silver here, I probably wouldn't have, I understand that the red ends up being part of his alt mode, but I probably would have carried it around or left it out. It breaks up his thighs in a way that I think makes them look thinner than they actually are. It's just another area where his deco's broken up and it makes an already relatively slender bot feel all the thinner. If we move over to Soundwave, Soundwave's color scheme I think is made that little bit easier by it being a simpler color scheme to begin with, but they've done a magnificent job with how thin the apps are on his chest screen, and I really like the picking out of these couple little gold bits. I think it does a little bit of extra heavy lifting. Same as I was really glad to see that they did the same sort of stripe work that we see on Starscream with the red picked out. You've got it at the bottom of his wrist, and you've also got it on his gun, which is a really nice touch. It just helped break them up a little bit. I do also think it was very cool of them to go ahead and pick out some of these internal workings in not quite as metallic-y a finish as Starscream had, but still it's just a really nice way to break up that sculpt and make it feel like there's a little bit more going on. The silver used to pick out all the details across this abdomen section, that's where I think you still get some sort of, Bayverse aesthetics coming through with how complicated and mechanized a lot of the design work is. I think that's a really neat touch. Same as they've balanced out and carried through some of that gold line work on his shins there as well. Using the black plastic to pick out the joints on his legs to break that up a bit as well. Also a good idea, otherwise it could have felt a little flat in reality, but instead it just makes him feel all the more fully actualized, I think. Same as picking out some different colors on that head sculpt. Personally, in terms of design, I'm not a huge fan of how he's got that blue stripe up the middle, which kind of look like a couple of massive nostrils. I would have rather that just be, the solid mouth plate. But it is how they did it, so you can't really fault it, can you? Now, I know that, the siege-style battle damage is not everybody's cup of tea, but given the kind of protracted, we've been at war for millions of years vibe that opening Bumblebee scene was going for, I do think that both of these molds could have been enhanced deco-wise by having some of that battle damage. I know that a lot of people don't like it, but personally, imagine how cool some of these surface details would have looked if they'd been picked out with a little bit of dry brushing and things like that. I think it would have helped to give them that sort of larger-than-life quality that you really got from that scene. God, that was a good scene. And a good movie. Good times all round. And given that, trying to pick one over the other deco-wise on these toys is almost impossible, and given that I think both of them definitely would have benefited from having some damage apps, I think that this category can be a point both ways. So point Starscream, point Soundwave. So, Posability is where we're actually going to flip the script a little bit. So let's have a look at our respective Deceptor dudes, shall we? Soundwave's accuracy and good-looking sculpt is not without cost. So let's start from the top. His head is on a ball joint, but I personally don't think you get quite enough out of that ball joint. You can do some look-arounds and look-downs as well as some up, but I just feel a little bit like his head is sitting too close to his body, and I think he could really benefit from having a little bit more neck. The shoulders go up so he can T-pose if you get that shoulder cannon out of the way. You've got a full rotation at the shoulder, and then you've got a double jointed elbow, so you can kind of get a bend there and then a bend up, but it's not really a fully realized double elbow joint. It's a bit weird. And the effect I find is more often than not, it kind of just makes his arms feel a little bit short. No wrist swivel. He does also have a bicep swivel on a mushroom peg. But just when he's standing at ease, where his shoulders are mounted, if you want to have his arms away from his body, it means he's kind of shrugging a little bit, and it makes his arms look even shorter than they are. He does have a waist swivel. It's hindered by one of my least favorite engineering cues, the full skirt panel. So you can get him, you know, all the way around, but I hate it when it's the big skirt panel like this. I infinitely would have rathered, even if this was thinner, or if they had somehow separated it out so that this was 2 skirt panels mounted off the center and his waist swivel was a little bit higher up. Most poses that you try and throw him in, if you've got any waist twist to it, it means this whole panel has to come up, and it's just not a good look. It's not a vibe. So when figures do have this kind of panel, it's almost really like they don't even have a waist swivel because it ruins the aesthetics to use it. Hips are on a universal, you can get pretty good clearance, and whilst he can come quite forward, again, it's flipping up that panel, which I hate, so you may as well not even use it. If it's just a slight forward, it's not as bad, but still, hate it. Not about it. At least if you want, he can go wide, and you can bypass that skirt, but it's not ideal. He does have exceptional knees. They're on like another double sort of hinge, but because of his paneling, there are clearance issues. His feet have a bit of forward and back, which is really nice, as well as a pretty good rocker to him. There's something, it's really these arms, these shoulders that bother me. There's just something about them that just feels counterintuitive. Personally, I would have rathered if, rather than hinging from here, if this had been fixed, and rather than this panel coming forward here, I would have rathered it was a side panel, and so his shoulders bent up from inside the shoulder rather than where they attach to kind of his traps. If they'd done that, you'd still be able to T-pose him, but when you did, it wouldn't have this bizarre, unnatural quality to it. By comparison, Starscream is really quite the bendy boy. So let's start from the top and work our way down just like we did with Soundwave. Now this might sound like a counterpoint to the one I just made, but his head is on one of the weirdest bowl joints I've ever encountered. It really doesn't give you any motion at all other than left and right. At first I didn't think it was on a bowl joint, but you can see inside his skull there, it is, and if you try and bend it up or do too much with it, that head ends up just coming right off of his little pin joint. Although I will say this, at least he has a neck. His shoulders could do a full, 360, but they're obviously limited by his wings, which, if you want, you can bend completely out of the way to get that full range of motion. His shoulders are also mounted in a much more sensible place, so you can still get pretty good T, but it doesn't ruin any of his lines or his aesthetics, and it just sets him up to do a good gangster lean. He has very deep elbows and get right up high, which is awesome to see. He also has mushroom peg bicep swivel. Still no wrist swivel, but at least, you get a little bit of a bend because of transformation. If we come down, he has a waist swivel as well. It is hindered by this panel, which you can fold up out the way for a little bit more, but I like the way this is mounted and designed so much more, because even if that is bent forward, it doesn't ruin any of the lines or any of the aesthetics that you kind of want from him. And really, who's needing to turn their waist more than this anyway? Eh? We've got a universal at the hips, so he can kick up real high because of his better clearances. You can also get that leg quite far back, then a just past 90 knee. So you can get those legs into some awesome mid-air flying positions slash some pretty cool superhero landing sort of positions as well. He does have, with his articulation, a much greater sense of fluid motion than you get from Soundwave. So despite him looking a little gangly and odd, once you start having him throw shapes, he throws some great shapes. You get a little bit of back and forward out of that foot, not a huge degree, but a little bit, crazy my foot style ankle tilts. So when it comes to one's ability to throw shapes, Starscream is undeniably the winner of the posability point. Alrighty, let's go ahead and have a look at what is potentially one of the more contentious and controversial categories where these two are concerned: accessorize. So, Starscream comes with this gun hand thing, which I am not a huge fan of. I do not think that looks very good stuck onto his arm. It doesn't sit very evenly when he's like got a straight arm going. I always find that if you have it plugged in so that it doesn't fall off, right? It's got a little bit of a gangster lean to it, which I don't imagine it would really have. Then he also has what I guess is an attempt at his null rays on his wings. So you can take these off, and if you really wanted to, you can put them in his hands for a little hot rod-esque, dual pistol-y kind of action. But again, they've got a really, really shallow peg, and they don't go in great. I know that their movie designs don't have, you know, the null rays on the arms, but I don't know, these just feel too short to be particularly cool in, like, vehicle mode. They look okay stuck on his wings, but them being in black is a little bit of an odd choice, I think. When everything else has so much of, like, the deco picked out with apps, just to have these two sort of little black guns sitting there doesn't really do it for me. I personally, given how shallow the ports are, I don't think it really would have been too difficult to have them mount on the side of his arms there. Because of where the mushroom peg is, you still could have had it twist around. Like, if this port had been up the back, they could have just tabbed on there, and I feel like that would have gone a long way to finishing off that sort of more traditional Seeker sort of silhouette. And I would have appreciated that as an option. But they didn't do it, and so we're just left with these. They just feel flimsy, I don't know. If you're not using this, there's not really anywhere useful to store it that I've noticed. I guess you can pull that out if you wanted to and stick it on there so it's kind of behind his head, right? But that's not a great look, really. It kind of makes him look like he's got Scourge's head crest kind of thing going on. All in all, for me, I find Starscream's accessories to be a little bit of a bust. Now, Soundwave, let's go ahead and take this off because, you know, this extra piece is part of the controversy, but we'll get into that in a moment. So Soundwave just by himself comes with this blaster, which, being just cast in black, doesn't feel out of place because it's not really part of his alt mode, so you feel like he's just gone and, you know, picked that up at Robo Depot. Pew, pew. And he also comes with his big-ass patented shoulder cannon, which I think is actually quite cool in the way that they've done it, because it's got this levered piece, so you can have, you know, a bit of articulation out of that shoulder cannon, which is always nice. Then if you collapse it down, you've got a second peg so that he can actually wield it like a more traditional gun. With how he holds it, it's a little bit comically long. It's a little bit like Joker's gun from the first Batman movie with a really long barrel. But, you know, it's an option. You can also take this gun, and because he's got the two ports there, you can actually store it on his back. So he already has better weapon storage than Starscream does. And I don't know, I just love a blaster slung across a Transformer's back. I know it's not a huge deal, but weapon storage is an important one for me, and Soundwave's got it. The problem I think that most people had with this figure, besides not being able to reach, you know, his own tape deck button, they gave us a spring-loaded chest plate, right? To have Soundwave do the things that Soundwave is known for done doing, you had to go ahead and make a separate purchase, which was this little body grub. Now, he's kind of just a hunk of metal. It's like he's playing hide and seek, or like, you know when, you know, your dog or your cat just kind of curls up into a really tight ball? It's got that kind of vibe. So I'm kind of two minds about this. Traditionally, most Soundwave figures will come with at least, you know, one cassette for your play pleasure. This one came with none. So there's the way of looking at it where, I'm glad they gave us the, you know, option and the ability to be able to have him fully realized and get a Ravage in the mix. But then there's also another school of thought, I think, where it's like, well, should I have to buy extra things to make things do the things that they're supposed to do, right? As cool as, you know, I do think this Ravage, despite his alt mode just being a lump, I do think he's a pretty cool, awesome little posable dude. But should you have to make another purchase to do this? You be the judge. Oh no, actually, I'll be the judge. I'll be the judge of that. And honestly, I don't think you should. Because this like extra missile piece, which is a very classic Soundwavy kind of little doodah, that came with Ravage. So to finish off the whole look and get Soundwave the way you want him, you had to buy Ravage. I mean, I know we didn't see Laserbeak in the movie, but we didn't see his alt mode in the movie either, and he still has one of those. So if they wanted to make Ravage a separate purchase point, I don't think it would have hurt to have come with like quite a simple Laserbeak. So that at least then, if you only bought Soundwave, you could still have him function as you expect a Soundwave to. So when it comes to accessories, I do think Soundwave comes out on top, and I would give him the point, but because you had to buy Ravage to get him there, I'm actually going to take a point. That's a penalty. Penalty mark for you, Soundwave. Ooh, controversy. Controversy about... Now, both of these bots have quite complex transformations. It's just one of them is justifiably so, and the other one seems really arbitrary that it's actually this difficult, and there's just not really the payoff for it. I'm sure you can pretty well guess how this one's going to play out. Alright, credit where credit's due. This is a difficult alt mode to pull off. The Tetrajet is always a tough one, without making it a shell former. And I quite like the Bumblebee movie interpretation of it. Do feel like all this stuff down the bottom, if you're a jet, would create like a reasonable amount of drag as you were flying, but at least like, you know, his crumb bum weapon makes sense in this mode. I do think as well that all these little like space filler pieces that folded out, whilst, you know, they're not perfect, especially these ones here, they do a really nice job of filling out some of those shapes to make them feel a little bit more fluid. I do feel like this open part here, I feel like this should twist around so that that's on the bottom. I think that would have made it look a little bit cooler. I do love how bing sharp a lot of these lines are. And I do also really enjoy that they didn't feel the need to make this out of too soft a plastic. I do, however, kind of think the angle that these thrusters are on would mean that he's kind of forever being shot down into the ground. You know, aerodynamics is not what this is about. They're alien robots. Who knows? Maybe their atmosphere works different. Who are we to judge? Well, arguably that's the whole point of this. But still, on the whole, pretty happy with this as an alt mode. I like the shape of the wings. You wouldn't sort of necessarily expect the wings to end up sitting in this kind of shape when you first look at it. So, whilst initial pictures kind of made me think that this alt mode was a bit of a bust, in hand, it's pretty cool. It's definitely a Cybertronian alt mode. There's no arguments there. On the whole, I think the Bumblebee Studio Series figures have done a better job of Cybertronian alt modes than Siege managed to do. With the exception maybe of Starscream. God, I love that Siege Starscream. Now, Panini Boy on the other hand, he kind of just looks like a smashed crab, right? Like, for how many different bits and biddles and stuff are going on with that transformation, like, points for trying, and while you're transforming him, you are kind of like, okay, well this must be going somewhere. But then, by the time you actually get to that finished alt mode, I do find myself being a little bit like, what is this? What is this? And given as well that this canopy is like a faux chest canopy, I think they should have put the port there so at least you could mount this gun on top, and then he kind of would have felt like he was, you know, a hover tank or something like that. Honestly, I feel like just having a port there for that to mount there would have made people a lot more forgiving of this alt mode than what they have been. I do get that it's kind of like a little bit of a noddy reference to that one time he sort of looked a bit like this in G.I. Joe. On the whole, not particularly impressed. Because of his, you know, universal joints and stuff, it's also quite difficult to get it to line up so it sits flush. Oh man, this is powerfully average. Just so powerfully average. If you thought Siege Soundwave had a dud transformation, holy smackerel. Look at this. I mean, I guess it kind of fills out some of its shapes and things, but it's almost like he's turned into a cassette for himself, for an even bigger Soundwave. And then if you flip it around, well, that's just him doing some complicated yoga, right? Like, there's so much of Soundwave still there. I guess props for being able to still have Ravage in there if you wanted to. I don't know if it'll come up. It is kind of cool. I don't know if you can see it in there. Inside of that faux cockpit, there is a lot of sculpted detail, and it looks like, you know, there's some little seats and things, so that's pretty nifty. But who are they for? Who's sitting in there? That's what I want to know. This is just underwhelming. And given that they weren't being, you know, they didn't have their hands tied by having to make him look like he did in the movie alt mode wise, I can't help but feel they could have done a little bit better than this. So when it comes to alt mode, I'm gonna have to say, advantage Starscream. And our last category of today's SmackDown, the vibe. Hand feel and shelf appeal. So when it comes to this one, they're both very good toys, but I feel like if you've got a Bumblebee movie toys display kind of setup, and someone gives you the, you know, Toy Story rules of you can only take one toy, one toy, one toy. I think, and I'm gonna have to go with my gut on this one, but I think I'm gonna have to give the vibe point to Soundwave. Since getting them, Soundwave has spent a lot of time on my desk next to my computer as I've just generally been working, and Starscream has had no desk time. So what do we think? Did you score them the same way I would have scored them? Who was your favourite out of these two? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below, and as always, ring those bells, click those clicks, do all the things that I need you to do to make my monster grow. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.